What do you think the government is hiding from us? Story 1. There are likely some ungodly, dangerous bioweapons kept in a freezer somewhere. I'm talking about more dangerous than nukes, Captain Trips-level potential human extinction crap. For instance, a high-level Soviet defector has asserted in several books and publications that they crossed smallpox with Ebola. Oh, and they for sure fucked with myelin sheaths. Created a form of Legionella that caused rapid onset paralysis, reminiscent of multiple sclerosis. The insidious thing is that it apparently happens after you've cleared the infection, so there's no clue to medical professionals as to what's wrong with you. It was damn near 100% fatal in animal testing. That's just skimming the surface. Lots of research was done on super plague, the most virulent Y. pestis strains with diphtheria toxins genetically spliced in, then given antibiotic resistance. Story 2. They hide a lot of incompetence or mismanagement of money or theft. I worked for a few years for a smaller federal department. The administration bought brand new monitors for every admin staff, except that they bought 3 times the amount needed, and instead of returning the unused ones, they let them sit in a warehouse and eventually sold them to the public for pennies on the dollar. Some people in HR were caught creating new positions in various departments, filling them with their friends/family. People had complained about these phantom assistants, but HR did nothing about them. Shocking. For many years. It was something that had been going on for at least 5 years when I started there. When the people in HR got caught, the remedy was to fire one person, but all the 50-plus people they had hooked up with fake/unneeded jobs were technically employed there, so they all got to keep their jobs. Story 3. We know about a few incidents already, things like nuclear close calls during the Cold War, but it's hard to believe we've heard the full story. When you look at how many weapons, systems, and human decisions were involved over decades, it seems almost inevitable that there were moments where the world came terrifyingly close to annihilation. And I'm not talking about things were tense or leaders were worried. I mean situations where a radar system misread something, a missile was almost launched, or a chain of events was only stopped by one person making the right call at the last possible second. It wouldn't even have to be intentional. Modern systems are complicated, and history has shown that accidents, miscommunications, and technical failures happen all the time. When you combine that with weapons capable of destroying civilization, the margin for error becomes incredibly small. The reason I think some of those incidents might stay hidden is simple: the public reaction. If people realized that the survival of the entire planet may have depended on a single officer ignoring protocol or a machine malfunctioning at the right moment, it would probably shake a lot of confidence in the systems meant to protect us. So it wouldn't surprise me if somewhere in classified archives there are reports describing moments when the world came minutes or even seconds away from disaster, and the decision was made that letting everyone know just how close we got wouldn't do anyone any good. Story 4. From the public perspective, governments often appear very structured and deliberate. Policies are announced formally, officials speak in carefully prepared statements, and everything is presented as if there's a clear plan behind it all. But in reality, governments are made up of ordinary people working inside huge, complicated organizations, and any large organization run by humans tends to have mistakes, miscommunication, and bad decisions happening all the time. When you think about the scale of government, millions of employees, thousands of agencies, massive budgets, and decisions affecting entire countries, it's hard to imagine that things run smoothly all the time. There are probably constant disagreements, rushed decisions, internal politics, and occasional major errors that never become public. Some of those mistakes likely stay hidden simply because revealing them wouldn't really help anyone and could create unnecessary panic or distrust. Other times, it might just be embarrassment. No institution likes to publicly admit that a major problem happened because of human error. History already shows that governments sometimes make serious miscalculations or mishandle situations, and those are only the ones that eventually come to light years later through investigations or declassified documents. So the unsettling thought is that the people running huge systems that affect millions of lives are still just people with the same limitations, biases, and occasional incompetence that exist everywhere else. The difference is that their mistakes can happen on a much bigger stage. Story 5. One thing that's pretty widely believed is that governments, especially the military, are probably sitting on technology and research that the public won't see for many years. This has actually happened a lot. New military aircraft, surveillance technology, and weapon systems are often developed and tested in secret long before anyone outside the program knows they exist. By the time the public finally hears about them, the technology may already be a decade or more old. For example, stealth aircraft programs were kept classified for years while they were being tested. The military flew them, refined them, and developed tactics for them long before the public even knew those planes were real. The same idea applies to certain types of research. Governments fund huge amounts of advanced mathematics, physics, cryptography, and computer science for defense purposes. Some of that work stays classified because it could reveal capabilities related to encryption, code breaking, radar systems, or other technologies that rely on very specialized math. So it wouldn't be surprising if there are entire research projects or mathematical breakthroughs that only exist inside classified programs for now. It doesn't necessarily mean there are secret sci-fi inventions hidden away, but it does mean that the cutting edge of some military and intelligence research probably isn't visible to the public until long after it's already been developed. In other words, the technology we hear about today might sometimes represent what was cutting edge 10 or 15 years ago behind closed doors. Story 6. Just how advanced some of their weapons technology actually is. Historically, major military breakthroughs have often stayed classified for years or even decades before the public learned about them. During wartime especially, governments pour enormous amounts of money and research into developing new capabilities, and many of those projects stay hidden until they're either deployed or no longer strategically sensitive. Because of that history, it wouldn't be surprising if there are weapon systems being tested or developed right now that the public hasn't heard about yet. These might not necessarily be sci-fi death rays, but they could involve things like new types of cyber warfare tools, autonomous systems, advanced electronic warfare, or highly sophisticated surveillance and targeting technology. The logic for keeping that kind of work secret is fairly straightforward. If other countries know exactly what capabilities exist, they can develop ways to counter them. Keeping new technology classified gives the military an advantage, at least for a while. There are also entire research programs focused on emerging technologies like artificial intelligence, quantum computing, advanced materials, and directed energy systems. Some of that research eventually becomes public, but other parts remain restricted because they could have national security implications. So while there's no clear evidence of hidden superweapons straight out of science fiction, history suggests that governments often do know things about their own capabilities that the public won't learn about until much later. The cutting edge of military technology tends to stay behind closed doors for a long time. Story 7. A huge amount of incredibly boring, mundane stuff that ended up classified by accident and just never got cleaned up. When people hear top secret, they imagine alien technology, secret weapons, or massive conspiracies. But the reality of large bureaucracies is usually a lot less exciting. Governments generate massive amounts of paperwork every single day, and during sensitive projects or military operations, it's often easier to classify everything connected to them rather than carefully sorting out what actually needs to stay secret. Over time, that creates a strange situation. Documents that were stamped secret or top secret decades ago might contain things that are completely harmless now. Old technical reports, routine communications, outdated procedures, or meeting notes that nobody outside the department would even find interesting. But declassifying material takes time and manpower. Someone has to review it, make sure it doesn't accidentally reveal something sensitive, and go through the administrative process to release it. For many agencies, it's simply not worth the effort when there are higher priorities, so the files stay locked away. After years or decades, people start imagining those archives must contain incredible hidden knowledge, when in reality, a huge portion of it might just be boring reports, outdated research, and everyday government paperwork that nobody ever bothered to revisit. In other words, the biggest secret might just be how much of the classified system is filled with ordinary documents that got stuck behind a stamp and never came out again. Story 8. One thing some people speculate about is whether governments, especially large military powers, have extreme last resort weapons or technologies that would only ever be used if the country faced total collapse or invasion. The idea comes from the way militaries often plan for worst-case scenarios. Defense planning isn't just about everyday conflicts. It also includes contingency plans for situations where normal deterrence has failed and survival is at stake. Because of that, some people think there might be highly classified systems designed specifically for those moments. Historically, governments have kept very powerful technologies secret while they were being developed. The classic example is the Manhattan Project, where tens of thousands of people worked on building the first atomic weapons without the general public knowing what was happening until the bombs were used in 1945. Today, a lot of advanced research happens in areas like artificial intelligence, cyber warfare, directed energy systems, hypersonic weapons, and experimental defense technologies. Some of that work is publicly acknowledged, but other parts stay classified because revealing details could allow other countries to copy or counter them. That doesn't necessarily mean there are hidden doomsday devices waiting to be deployed, but it does mean militaries often invest in capabilities the public doesn't fully see yet. The reasoning is simple. If you want an advantage in a worst-case situation, you don't advertise exactly what you're capable of until you absolutely have to. So, while we don't know what might exist behind classified programs, history suggests that the most advanced military tools are often developed quietly, long before the public ever hears about them. Story 9. Operation Gladio and the broader network of Cold War stay-behind programs. After World War II, many Western European countries, often working with intelligence services connected to NATO, set up secret resistance networks in case the Soviet Union ever invaded Western Europe. The idea was that if a communist occupation happened, these groups would operate underground, conducting sabotage, intelligence gathering, and guerrilla warfare behind enemy lines. In Italy, this network became known as Operation Gladio, and similar programs existed in several other countries. What made the program controversial later on was that parts of these networks allegedly became connected to far-right militant groups, intelligence agencies, and sometimes criminal organizations during the Cold War. In the 1990s, Investigations in Italy and other countries revealed that these secret structures had existed for decades without the knowledge of most of the public or even many elected officials. Some critics and historians have argued that elements within these networks may have been involved in covert political operations, proxy conflicts, or attempts to influence domestic politics during periods of tension with communist movements. Supporters of the original programs maintain that they were created strictly as defensive contingency plans against a possible Soviet invasion. The full scope of what happened remains debated, but the existence of the networks themselves was eventually acknowledged. For many people, the revelation reinforced the idea that during major geopolitical struggles like the Cold War, governments sometimes built complex covert systems and alliances that remained hidden for years before the public ever learned about them. Story 10. I will reply on behalf of the guy at my dad's work, though I don't know if he uses Reddit. There is a guy at my dad's work who is extremely similar to Fox Mulder in personality and openly discusses his beliefs at their cafeteria. I will give some quick context. My dad works for an aerospace company that is responsible for the maintenance on many of Boeing and the U.S. military's aircraft, as well as looking over designs and whatnot. So, by nature, their jobs involve a lot of corporate and government information that they cannot disclose. Spooky, whatever his name is, I don't recall, story goes as such. While visiting one of the company's many other divisions, meaning in another state, Spooky Mulder claims he saw government vehicles that were actively using anti-gravity. His main story of seeing anti-gravity technology being used seems to be when he saw a man take a machine to an aircraft wing that was dented, and it used anti-gravity to pull the dent out, obviously not a vacuum pump or anything. This guy is now convinced the government he works for hides anti-gravity technology among other things. This is the story as I have been told. And naturally, he believes there are aliens present on Earth. I have tried to get my dad and his co-workers to call him Spooky, insert last name here, but I do not know if I have been successful. Story 11. How far ahead some of their technology actually is compared to what the public sees. A lot of people assume the cutting edge of technology is whatever companies are releasing right now, but historically, the military and intelligence agencies have often been years ahead in certain areas. The public version of technology usually appears after it's been tested, refined, and sometimes even replaced by something better inside classified programs. A good example is surveillance and data analysis. Governments invest huge amounts of money into research involving artificial intelligence, pattern recognition, and large-scale data processing. Because those systems are tied to national security or intelligence work, the exact capabilities are rarely discussed publicly. Facial recognition is one area where people suspect the gap might exist. Public systems already work fairly well under controlled conditions, but intelligence agencies likely have access to much larger data sets, more computing power, and more advanced algorithms. With those resources, their systems could potentially identify people across different lighting conditions, angles, ages, or partial images more reliably than what most commercial tools can do today. The reason governments would keep that kind of capability quiet is fairly obvious. If adversaries know exactly what a surveillance system can or cannot detect, they can design ways to avoid it. So while the public sees one version of technology through consumer products and research papers, it's very possible that the systems used inside intelligence or defense organizations are a few steps further along, especially in areas like cybersecurity, data analysis, and surveillance technology. Story 12. Who actually makes the biggest decisions behind the scenes? From the outside, Governments look very straightforward. We elect leaders, those leaders appoint officials, laws get passed, and policies are announced publicly. It gives the impression that the people we see on television are the ones fully in charge. But modern governments are incredibly large and complex systems. Behind every president, prime minister, or public official, there are layers of advisors, intelligence agencies, military leadership, career bureaucrats, economic advisors, lobbyists, and corporate interests, all influencing decisions in different ways. Because of that, some people suspect the real balance of power isn't always obvious. Public leaders might set direction and make final decisions, but the information they receive, the options presented to them, and the pressures applied by different institutions can shape what choices are actually available. There are also permanent institutions that exist regardless of who gets elected. Things like national security agencies, central banks, regulatory bodies, and large defense or intelligence organizations. Those systems continue operating across multiple administrations and often have enormous influence simply because they control expertise, information, and infrastructure. So when people ask, who really calls the shots, the unsettling possibility is that there isn't one clear answer. Power in large systems is often distributed across networks of institutions and individuals, many of whom most citizens never hear about. Which means the people we see making announcements might sometimes be only one visible part of a much larger decision-making machine. Story 13. How public funds are actually managed behind the scenes. In countries like Singapore, a lot of government money doesn't just sit in a simple national bank account. Instead, large portions are managed through state investment funds and financial institutions that invest globally. The idea behind this system is to grow national reserves over time so the country has financial stability in the future. For example, Singapore's government-linked investment companies invest in stocks, real estate, infrastructure, and other assets around the world. Those funds are meant to generate returns that support long-term economic stability, social programs, and government spending. However, because these funds operate in global markets and make complex investments, the details of every single transaction or strategy aren't always fully public. Governments often argue that revealing too much about investment strategies could weaken their ability to compete in financial markets. That lack of visibility can make people suspicious, especially when taxes rise or the cost of living increases. When citizens feel financial pressure but can't clearly see where money is going, it's natural for questions and speculation to grow. In reality, the situation is usually less dramatic than corruption or secret losses, but financial transparency and government investment funds is a constant public debate in many countries. People want reassurance that national money is being managed responsibly, and when information feels limited, it can easily create the feeling that something important is being kept out of sight. Story 14. How powerful modern satellite imaging actually is, especially the kind used by governments and intelligence agencies. Most countries with advanced space programs operate reconnaissance satellites that can take extremely detailed images of the Earth. These systems are designed for military intelligence, surveillance, and mapping, so their capabilities are often classified or only partially disclosed. Because of that secrecy, people sometimes assume the technology is far more powerful than what the public sees through commercial satellite images like those used in mapping apps. However, experts generally agree that even the best optical satellites have physical limits. Imaging from hundreds of kilometers above Earth is constrained by things like atmospheric distortion, the size of the telescope, and the wavelength of light. Those limits make extremely tiny details, like reading a license plate from orbit, very difficult or unlikely with traditional optical imaging. What military satellites are believed to be very good at is tracking larger objects, vehicles, aircraft, ships, and infrastructure with high precision. Some systems can revisit the same location frequently, detect movement, and combine multiple types of sensors such as radar, infrared, or multispectral imaging. Governments also combine satellite imagery with other forms of surveillance, drones, aircraft, ground sensors, and intelligence data, which together can create very detailed pictures of activity in certain areas. So, while the exact capabilities of classified reconnaissance satellites aren't publicly known, the general consensus among experts is that they are extremely powerful, but still bound by the laws of physics, even if they're significantly more advanced than what's available commercially. Story 15. How much uncertainty there actually is behind the scenes. From the outside, governments try to project the image that everything is under control. Leaders speak confidently, policies are announced as if they're carefully calculated, and decisions are presented as part of some well-planned strategy. But the reality is that running a country is incredibly complicated, and a lot of decisions are made under pressure with incomplete information. In many ways, it's similar to what happens when people grow up and realize adulthood isn't as organized as it looked when they were kids. When you're younger, parents seem like they know exactly what they're doing all the time. Then you get older and realize they were often just figuring things out as they went along, doing their best with the information they had. Government leadership can be a lot like that. Officials have advisors, experts in data, but they still have to make choices about unpredictable things like economic shifts, technological changes, global conflicts, and natural disasters. Often there isn't a perfect answer, just a few options that all come with risks. The reason governments might avoid openly admitting that level of uncertainty is simple: public confidence matters. If leaders constantly said, "We're not entirely sure what the right move is," it could cause panic or make institutions seem unstable. So the unsettling possibility is that many major decisions affecting millions of people are made by individuals who are doing their best, but are still navigating uncertainty much more than the public realizes. Story 16. One thing a lot of people joke about when talking about government secrets is that they hope the hidden stuff is exciting, even though history suggests it's usually a lot more mundane. When people imagine classified information, they tend to picture dramatic revelations, alien contact, secret technologies, hidden civilizations, or something that completely changes our understanding of the world. The idea that somewhere in a vault there's proof that extraterrestrials exist or that some incredible discovery has been kept from humanity is obviously way more interesting. But when secrets actually come out years later, they often turn out to be much less glamorous. More often, it's things like covert political operations, intelligence programs, surveillance systems, or attempts to influence events in other countries during geopolitical conflicts. During the Cold War, for example, many governments secretly supported allies, funded propaganda, or interfered in foreign politics in ways that only became public decades later. Those kinds of revelations are historically significant, but they're not exactly the kind of mystery people imagine when they think of classified files. So there's always this funny gap between what people hope governments are hiding and what they're probably actually hiding. People want the secret to be something cosmic or mind-blowing, something that proves the universe is stranger than we thought. But most of the time, the truth is likely to be far more human. Messy political decisions, questionable strategies, and operations that seemed like good ideas at the time, but would look pretty bad if they were fully revealed, which is a lot less exciting than aliens, but probably a lot closer to reality. Story 17. How pointless public politics are. in comparison to, say, Lockheed Martin and General Dynamics influencing FAA decisions that make them billions. Tobacco and alcohol companies donate hundreds of millions to keep certain plants illegal. Sugar companies who are able to pass laws to enable a pseudo-monopoly. Insurance companies who, by mere fact they're not non-profit, are passing laws forcing more and more coverage that protects you less and less. These are predatory companies who want a tiny bit more profit from you. If you picked apart Washington, you wouldn't find people. You would find corporations. Democrat. This Republican. Quit pretending those words mean anything. We need to remove the super wealthy influence from the government. Everything else is just a puppet entertaining the public who think they are voting on the issue. Story 18. How much global suffering could theoretically be reduced if resources were distributed differently? When you look at the world's total production, food, clothing, housing materials, and knowledge, there is a strong argument that humanity already produces enough to meet basic needs for everyone on the planet. Global agriculture alone produces enormous amounts of food each year, and technological progress has made education and communication far more accessible than ever before. Yet, millions of people still experience poverty, hunger, and lack of access to basic services. Many critics believe this gap exists not because humanity lacks resources, but because the global economic system prioritizes profit, markets, and national interests over universal distribution of necessities. Businesses often operate under incentives that reward efficiency and profitability rather than ensuring everyone's needs are met. Governments, meanwhile, have to balance political pressures, budgets, and economic systems that are deeply interconnected. From that perspective, some people argue that the world has implicitly accepted a certain level of inequality and hardship as a byproduct of how the system currently works. Others push back on that view and say the issue is far more complicated. Logistics, infrastructure, political stability, corruption, and local governance all play major roles in whether resources actually reach the people who need them. Still, the uncomfortable question remains part of many global debates. If humanity has the capability to reduce suffering on a massive scale, how much of the remaining problem comes from limitations, and how much comes from choices about how systems are structured? Story 19. How severe certain long-term risks could become, especially when it comes to climate change and resource pressures. Climate scientists already publish a lot of research about rising temperatures, sea level rise, extreme weather, and how these changes could affect food systems, water availability, infrastructure, and migration. Much of this information is public, but the details can be complex and uncertain, which makes it difficult for the average person to grasp the full range of possible outcomes. Where the speculation comes in is around what governments privately model or plan for. Large governments often run internal risk assessments and scenario planning. These can include worst-case projections about droughts, crop failures, supply chain disruptions, energy shortages, or large population movements caused by environmental changes. Some of these analyses are used for national security or infrastructure planning and aren't always widely publicized. The reason isn't necessarily that leaders are hiding a guaranteed disaster. A lot of the projections involve uncertainty ranges and depend heavily on future policies, technological developments, and global cooperation. But it's true that discussing the most extreme scenarios publicly can be politically sensitive. Governments often try to balance communicating risks with avoiding widespread panic or economic disruption. So, the uneasy thought some people have is that behind closed doors, there may be planners and scientists studying difficult possibilities that don't get talked about in simple terms in public. not necessarily because the situation is hopeless, but because the reality of long-term global challenges like climate change involves complicated trade-offs, uncertainty, and decisions that no country has fully solved yet. Story 20. One perspective I've heard a lot is that governments probably aren't hiding nearly as much as people imagine, simply because keeping big secrets for long periods of time is extremely difficult. Governments are huge organizations made up of thousands, sometimes millions of people. Every major project involves layers of employees, contractors, analysts, technicians, administrators, and politicians. The more people involved in something, the harder it becomes to keep it perfectly hidden. Humans make mistakes. People talk. Someone leaks information, writes a book after retirement, speaks to journalists, or releases documents years later. Over time, even highly classified programs tend to come out in some form. History has shown that many government secrets eventually become public through whistleblowers, declassification, investigative reporting, or simply because enough time has passed. That doesn't mean governments don't keep secrets at all. Military technology, intelligence methods, diplomatic negotiations, and security plans are often classified for obvious reasons. But the idea that there are massive world-changing secrets known by thousands of officials and somehow nobody ever leaks them becomes harder to believe when you consider how organizations actually work. The larger and more dramatic the supposed secret is, the more people would likely need to be involved in maintaining it. And the more people involved, the more likely it is that someone eventually talks. So, one reasonable conclusion some people reach is that governments probably do hide things, but not nearly as many huge, earth-shattering secrets as conspiracy theories often suggest. Story 21. I think it would be cool and horrifying to find out that everything is run by a hyper-intelligent AI that can predict future behavior, to the extent that it can call out hits on people who would threaten its existence before they're born. Like, damn, an entire flight went missing? Sorry, passengers 32A and 54B had grandchildren who would lead the resistance. A politician was kidnapped? Crap. That politician was going to wake up and make a press release. A boat just got bombed? Its motor was learning the ABCs. It would probably cash in on the productivity people offer when they're anxious or frightened about the future by creating wars and making people doubt the sanity of their leaders while also fearing their militaristic might. Wait. Story 22. How much influence large corporations and multinational companies actually have over political decisions. In modern economies, governments and big businesses are deeply connected. Corporations provide jobs, investment, technology, and tax revenue, while governments create the laws and regulations that businesses operate under. Because of that relationship, companies often try to influence policy in ways that benefit them. This influence can happen through things like lobbying, campaign donations, industry advisory groups, or economic pressure. In many countries, these practices are legal and regulated, but they can still raise concerns about whether corporate interests sometimes outweigh the interests of ordinary citizens. Critics argue that because large companies control huge amounts of money, resources, and economic power, they can shape policy discussions in ways that aren't always obvious to the public. Supporters of the system say businesses need a voice in policy making because regulations affect their ability to operate and contribute to the economy. The uncomfortable reality is that political decision-making is rarely as simple as government leaders decide everything. Instead, policies often emerge from negotiations between elected officials, government agencies, businesses, labor groups, advocacy organizations, and international institutions. That doesn't necessarily mean governments are completely controlled by corporations, but it does highlight how economic power can translate into political influence. For many people, the concern isn't just whether corporations have influence, but how transparent that influence is, and whether the balance between public interest and private power is being maintained. Story 23. What happened to Malaysia Airlines Flight MH370 disappearance than they publicly revealed. When the plane disappeared in March 2014, it seemed strange to many people that an aircraft carrying hundreds of passengers could simply vanish in the modern world. With satellites, radar systems, and military monitoring networks covering huge parts of the planet, it feels like something that large should have been tracked precisely. Because of that, some people believe military radar systems or intelligence satellites must have detected exactly where the plane went, and that governments chose not to release the full information for security reasons. However, aviation experts generally say the situation was more complicated. Civilian radar coverage is patchy in some ocean regions, and military radar systems are often designed to track threats rather than continuously monitor commercial aircraft far from national borders. Once the plane moved out over remote ocean areas, there were far fewer systems watching that specific region. Investigators eventually relied heavily on satellite communication data from the aircraft to estimate a large search area in the southern Indian Ocean. But even with that information, the region was enormous and extremely difficult to search. Because the disappearance remains unresolved, it naturally fuels speculation about hidden information. But most aviation investigators believe the reason the mystery remains unsolved isn't because governments secretly know the answer. It's because the ocean is vast, tracking systems are imperfect, and once a plane goes down in a remote area, recovering definitive evidence can be incredibly difficult. Story 24. One thing people sometimes point out is how interesting the origin of the internet actually is, and how it ended up shaping modern life in ways no one fully predicted. The early foundations of the internet were developed in the late 1960s through a project called ARPANET, which was funded by the US government through a research agency known today as DARPA. The goal wasn't to create social media or online shopping, but to build a communication network that could connect research institutions and remain functional even if parts of it were disrupted. Over time, universities, researchers, and eventually private companies expanded the network, turning it into what we now know as the Internet. What's interesting is how the system evolved. Once the technology became public and commercialized in the 1990s, companies built platforms, search engines, and services on top of it. Today, enormous amounts of personal data flow through those systems: location data, browsing habits, purchases, communication patterns, and more. Governments can sometimes access certain information through legal processes or intelligence programs, especially for national security investigations. At the same time, private technology companies themselves collect huge amounts of data for advertising and analytics. So while the internet wasn't originally designed as a giant surveillance tool, the infrastructure it created eventually became a world where vast amounts of information about human behavior are constantly generated and stored. The result is a system where technology, government interests, and corporate data collection all intersect in ways that people are still debating today. Story 25. The idea that intelligence agencies hold more influence over governments than the public realizes, partly because of the information they control. Intelligence services gather enormous amounts of data about foreign governments, organizations, and sometimes individuals who might become important in politics or national security. Because their work involves surveillance, investigations, and classified information, these agencies often know things that most other parts of government, and certainly the public, do not. The theory suggests that if intelligence organizations have compromising information about powerful figures, they could potentially use that knowledge to influence political decisions behind the scenes. In that scenario, officials wouldn't necessarily be openly threatened. Instead, the existence of damaging information could quietly limit how far someone is willing to go outside certain boundaries. However, there isn't clear evidence that intelligence agencies systematically control elected leaders this way. In most democratic systems, intelligence organizations are legally structured to operate under civilian leadership and oversight from elected officials, courts, and legislative committees. Those systems were designed specifically to prevent intelligence services from operating independently of government control. That said, intelligence agencies do have significant influence simply because of the information they provide. Leaders often rely heavily on intelligence briefings to make decisions about security, foreign policy, and crises. When you control information, you naturally shape how decisions are made. So, while the idea of intelligence agencies secretly controlling governments remains largely speculative, it reflects a real concern people have about the balance of power between secretive institutions and public democratic oversight. Story 26. The most obvious thing, to me, is how close our civilization is to collapsing. We've blown past CO2 emissions and degraded our biosphere to the point that we have locked in feedback loops that will ensure that the infinite growth economy we've been living in for the past 70 years is not going to be able to handle the stresses. Now we have terms like sustainable growth being touted by business leaders while we blow past the Paris Agreement, which was already considered a half measure, and kick the can down the road a few generations with tall tales about asteroid mining and carbon sequestration we don't have the technology for. Meanwhile, Trump begins to dismantle the EPA and delete climate record data. I think the dirty secret is that we passed the point of no return decades ago, and now the main agenda is how to conceal the impending consequences and avoid a panic for as long as possible. I mean, our entire global economy runs on the concepts of debt and growth. Those fall apart when people learn their children or grandchildren may be doomed to either suffocate or starve to death. Story 27 is the enormous number of classified documents that exist behind the scenes. Most people imagine classified information as something extremely dramatic: secret weapons, alien contact, or some huge hidden truth. But in reality, classification is used much more broadly than that. Governments produce huge amounts of reports, communications, intelligence briefings, research papers, diplomatic cables, and technical documents every day. Whenever those documents involve military capabilities, intelligence methods, sensitive negotiations, or national security planning, they often get stamped with some level of classification. Over time, this creates massive archives of information that the public never sees. Many of those documents probably aren't shocking or exciting. A lot of them are likely routine reports, meeting notes, internal analyses, or outdated research. But they stay hidden because releasing them could reveal intelligence sources, defense strategies, or relationships between governments. Another interesting part is that classification can last for decades. Some documents are eventually declassified after 20, 30, or even 50 years, which is why historians often discover new details about past events long after they happened. So when people ask what governments are hiding, the most realistic answer might simply be an enormous library of information, most of it probably mundane, some of it historically important, and a small portion potentially very sensitive. It's less about one giant secret and more about the fact that governments are constantly generating information that, for various reasons, they choose to keep out of public view for long periods of time. Story 28. I'd say it's safe to say that there are wars going on that we are unaware of because we are employing local gangs in whatever third world country we are occupying in order to fight our enemies, who are also using local gangs in whatever third world country. We hear about this every once in a while after the fact, but to be real, the government knows that legalizing drugs would end the drug war. And they know that oil is a dying industry, and fighting over it is just their way to keep the people in charge, or the people with money in the military, industrial complex, wealthy. They know these things, but without war, they have nothing. I'd imagine it's also safe to say that the Cold War never ended, and instead just moved to the Middle East, where Russia has been using their gangs, and we have been using our gangs to fight a proxy war, without the civilians of either country being any the wiser, as we all just thought it was about something else. It's just, if the events of the last year haven't made it apparent to everyone that the world is in much greater conflict on a much more covert scale than we previously realized, you're not paying attention. Story 29. That there are probably certain extreme scenarios where they don't actually have a workable solution, even though the public assumes they do. In most countries, governments try to maintain the image that there are plans for everything. Emergency response systems, disaster protocols, contingency planning, and crisis simulations all exist so that leaders can say they're prepared for major events. But the reality is that some situations are simply so large or unpredictable that planning only goes so far. For example, things like massive solar storms that could knock out global power grids, large-scale cyber attacks on infrastructure, global supply chain collapse, or certain kinds of biological threats are incredibly complex problems. Governments run simulations and prepare response strategies, but that doesn't necessarily mean there's a guaranteed way to manage them if they actually happened at full scale. Often the plans are more about damage control than solving the problem completely. What makes people uneasy is the possibility that officials might privately understand the limits of those plans. They may know that if certain worst-case scenarios occur, the response would involve improvisation, prioritizing limited resources, and trying to stabilize the situation rather than executing some perfect pre-written strategy. Admitting that openly could cause public fear or undermine confidence in institutions, so leaders tend to emphasize preparedness instead. So the uncomfortable possibility is that behind closed doors, there are probably briefings acknowledging that for some rare but catastrophic events, even the most prepared governments might still end up figuring things out in real time if they ever actually happen. Story 30. Large-scale social influence, where institutions try to subtly shape public behavior rather than control it directly. The idea often comes from comparisons to stories like Foundation, where a fictional science called psychohistory predicts and guides the behavior of entire populations. In real life, we obviously don't have anything that precise, but governments and institutions do sometimes use tools that influence how people think and act. For example, public policy often uses behavioral science techniques, sometimes called nudging. Governments might design messages or systems in ways that encourage certain choices, like promoting healthier habits, increasing tax compliance, or encouraging people to save more money. These methods rely on psychology and social research to gently steer decisions without forcing them. There are also broader forms of influence through public communication, media campaigns, education, and information strategies. During crises, like wars, pandemics, or major national programs, governments may actively try to shape public perception in order to guide behavior on a large scale. However, The idea that governments have some kind of near-perfect system to predict and control society like in science fiction is extremely unlikely. Human societies are far too complex and unpredictable for anything close to that level of control. Still, the concept resonates with people because it touches on a real question. How much our environment, information, messaging, incentives, and social pressure quietly shapes the choices we believe we're making independently? Story 31. Advanced artificial intelligence systems that are far more capable than what the public currently sees. The idea is that large governments already collect enormous amounts of data through various sources: public records, communication metadata, archived information, and large-scale data sets gathered over decades. Intelligence agencies and research institutions also invest heavily in technologies related to artificial intelligence, data analysis, and high-performance computing. Because of that, some people imagine a scenario where an extremely powerful AI system, something closer to artificial general intelligence, AGI, could exist inside classified research programs. In this theory, the system would process massive amounts of information about human behavior, communication patterns, economics, and global events. People sometimes combine this idea with emerging technologies like quantum computing, which in theory could dramatically increase computational power for certain types of problems. If you had a powerful AI system connected to huge data sets and advanced computing hardware, it could potentially analyze patterns in society, predict trends, or assist in complex strategic decisions. However, there's currently no credible evidence that true AGI exists anywhere, either publicly or inside classified government programs. Most experts in AI research say that creating a system with general intelligence comparable to humans remains an unsolved scientific challenge. Still, governments around the world do invest heavily in AI research because systems that can analyze massive data sets, recognize patterns, and support decision-making could be extremely valuable in fields like cybersecurity, intelligence analysis, and national security. So, while a hidden superintelligence system is mostly speculative, it reflects a real trend: the increasing importance of advanced computing and AI in how governments understand and manage large amounts of information. Story 32. Major conflicts or crises can sometimes serve as distractions from domestic political or economic issues. The reasoning behind the theory is that when a country is focused on a war or international crisis, public attention shifts heavily toward that issue. News coverage, political debate, and national conversation tend to revolve around the conflict, which can push other topics like economic policies, corruption investigations, or controversial legislation out of the spotlight. Historically, critics have occasionally accused governments of using external threats or conflicts to rally public support or redirect attention. The concept even has a name in political science: the rally around the flag effect, where people temporarily unite behind national leaders during international tensions. However, the idea that wars are intentionally created purely as distractions for domestic politics is much harder to support with evidence. Wars are extremely expensive, unpredictable, and politically risky, and they often create more problems for governments rather than fewer. Still, people's suspicion about distraction tactics reflects a broader concern about how political messaging works. Governments, like any organization, try to shape the narrative around events and emphasize issues that support their priorities. So while the idea that conflicts are staged purely as distractions is mostly speculative, it highlights a real dynamic in politics. Where public attention goes can strongly influence what policies are debated, scrutinized, or quietly passed without much notice. Story 33. The two major parties in the United States operate more similarly than they appear on the surface. In U.S. politics, the Democratic Party and the Republican Party dominate national elections and policymaking. Public debates often frame them as fundamentally opposed on many issues, and their supporters tend to strongly identify with one side or the other. However, critics sometimes argue that, despite these visible differences, both parties still operate within the same broader political and economic system. They may disagree on policies, priorities, and approaches, but they still share some structural similarities, such as reliance on large donors, political institutions, and long-established governing frameworks. Because of that, some people feel that political competition can resemble two teams arguing within the same system, rather than completely opposing forces trying to rebuild it from scratch. From this perspective, the intense rivalry between parties can sometimes overshadow the fact that both are working within the same national structure and constraints. Supporters of the system usually respond that the differences between parties still matter significantly in areas like economic policy, social policy, and international relations. Elections do lead to real changes in laws, regulations, and government priorities. Still, the idea resonates with many people because it touches on a broader frustration: the feeling that political systems sometimes prioritize maintaining the system itself rather than dramatically changing it, regardless of which party happens to be in power at the moment. Story 34. Exactly where all tax money ends up going. In theory, government budgets are public documents. Most countries release detailed reports showing how much money is spent on things like defense, healthcare, education, infrastructure, pensions, and social programs. On paper, the system is supposed to be transparent, but in practice, government spending can be incredibly complicated. Budgets often contain thousands of line items. Agencies distribute money through multiple layers of programs, and some spending, especially related to national security or intelligence, can be partially classified. That complexity makes it hard for the average person to easily track where every dollar actually goes. There are also situations where funds are routed through contractors, grants, subsidies, or long-term programs that aren't easy to understand without digging through a lot of financial documents. When people see taxes rising while services feel the same or worse, it naturally creates suspicion that money must be going somewhere unexpected. Part of the issue is simply scale. Modern governments manage enormous budgets involving infrastructure, defense systems, healthcare networks, research funding, disaster relief, and international commitments. Even when the information is technically public, it's often buried inside complex financial reports that most people never read. So the concern many people express isn't always that tax money is secretly disappearing, but that the system is so complicated and opaque that it's difficult for citizens to clearly see how their money is being used. And when something affects everyone's paycheck, that lack of clarity tends to make people uneasy. Story 35. Global nuclear testing in the mid-20th century might have had larger long-term health effects than most people realize, including cancer risks. Between the 1940s and the early 1960s, several countries conducted hundreds of nuclear weapon tests in the atmosphere. These tests released radioactive particles, often called nuclear fallout, that spread through the atmosphere and eventually settled across different parts of the world. Small amounts of radioactive isotopes, such as iodine-131 and cesium-137, were detected in soil, water, and even food supplies during that period. Because radiation exposure is known to increase the risk of certain cancers, Scientists studied the possible health impacts of this fallout for decades. Research has shown that people living close to test sites or downwind areas were sometimes exposed to higher radiation levels and did experience increased cancer risks in some cases. However, most scientific studies suggest that while nuclear testing fallout did contribute to some additional cancer cases, it is unlikely to be the main cause of cancer worldwide today. Cancer is influenced by many factors, including aging, genetics, smoking, diet, environmental exposures, infections, and other lifestyle or environmental risks. International agreements like the Partial Nuclear Test Ban Treaty were created partly because of concern about global fallout. After that treaty, most nuclear tests moved underground, which greatly reduced the amount of radioactive material released into the atmosphere. So while nuclear fallout from past testing did have measurable environmental and health impacts, current scientific evidence suggests that cancer has many causes, and fallout is only one piece of a much larger and more complex picture. Story 36. One thing many people believe governments might be hiding is evidence of extraterrestrial life. The idea has been around for decades, that somewhere in classified files there might be physical evidence, signals, or recovered technology proving that intelligent life exists beyond Earth. The theory often comes from the fact that governments and militaries track unidentified objects in the sky and sometimes keep the details of those observations classified. For example, reports of unidentified aerial phenomena, UAP, the modern term often used instead of UFO, have been studied by military and intelligence agencies because anything unknown in controlled airspace could potentially be a security concern. In recent years, some governments have even released videos and reports showing objects that pilots couldn't immediately identify. That secrecy naturally fuels speculation. People often wonder if governments might keep alien-related discoveries hidden to avoid public panic, protect advanced technology if something were recovered, or simply because officials don't fully understand what they're seeing. However, so far, there is no publicly verified evidence that governments possess confirmed extraterrestrial technology or proof of alien civilizations. Most unidentified sightings eventually turn out to have more ordinary explanations, such as sensor errors, atmospheric phenomena, experimental aircraft, or misidentified objects. Still, the possibility of extraterrestrial life remains one of the most fascinating scientific questions. Programs that search for signals from other civilizations continue to operate, and scientists are constantly studying exoplanets and other cosmic environments where life might exist. So while the idea that governments are hiding alien evidence remains speculative, it reflects a very real curiosity, whether humanity is truly alone in the universe or not. Story 37. Developing weapons in space that technically violate existing treaties, even though those treaties exist to prevent exactly that. One example that occasionally comes up in discussions is the idea of MIRV-equipped satellites. MIRV stands for Multiple Independently Targetable Re-entry Vehicle, which is a type of missile technology that allows a single missile to carry several nuclear warheads, each capable of hitting different targets. The technology has existed for decades on intercontinental ballistic missiles. The concern people raise is whether a satellite platform could theoretically deploy something similar from orbit. If a satellite carried weapons that could re-enter the atmosphere and strike targets, it would essentially act as an orbital strike system. This kind of concept would run directly into the rules established by the Outer Space Treaty, which prohibits placing nuclear weapons or other weapons of mass destruction in orbit around Earth. However, Verifying what actually exists in orbit can be difficult. Many satellites are classified military systems, and their exact capabilities aren't always public. That lack of transparency can lead to speculation about whether certain technologies might exist quietly behind the scenes. At the same time, deploying nuclear weapons in orbit would be extremely controversial and risky. Violating major international treaties could provoke serious global consequences and destabilize nuclear deterrence systems. So while the idea of orbital MIRV weapons shows up in speculation about secret military technology, there's no confirmed public evidence that such systems currently exist in space. Story 38. Clean energy technologies could power far more of the world than we currently use them for, but that progress is slowed by economic and political forces tied to fossil fuels. There's actually quite a bit of research showing that renewable energy sources like solar, wind, hydro, and geothermal have enormous potential. In many places today, solar and wind power are already among the cheapest ways to generate electricity. Large-scale renewable systems are expanding quickly in countries around the world. However, transitioning an entire energy system isn't simple. Modern societies built their infrastructure, power plants, transportation, industry, supply chains, around coal, oil, and natural gas over more than a century. Changing that system requires replacing huge amounts of infrastructure, upgrading power grids, building energy storage, and managing how energy is produced and delivered when the sun isn't shining or the wind isn't blowing. Fossil fuel industries also represent enormous economic interests. Companies in the oil, gas, and coal sectors employ millions of people and control valuable assets. Because of that, these industries often lobby governments and advocate for policies that protect their businesses. Critics argue that this influence slows the transition to cleaner energy even when the technology exists. Supporters of fossil fuels say the transition must be gradual to avoid economic disruption and energy shortages. So the issue usually isn't that clean energy is being secretly hidden. It's more that technology, economics, politics, and infrastructure all interact, which makes the shift toward renewable energy slower and more complicated than many people would like. The debate is really about how fast the world can realistically make that transition, and who benefits or loses along the way. Story 39. Money itself is largely a social construct, and the systems built around it mainly exist because they give certain people or institutions leverage over others. At its core, money is simply a way to represent value and make trade easier. Instead of directly exchanging goods and services, societies agreed to use a shared medium that everyone recognizes. In that sense, money only works because people collectively agree that it has value. The argument behind this theory is that if the world's resources, food, housing materials, energy, knowledge, were organized differently, humanity could theoretically meet everyone's basic needs without relying so heavily on financial competition. The planet produces enormous amounts of wealth and resources, and technology has made production more efficient than ever. However, the current economic system uses money not just for exchange, but also as a way to allocate power and incentives. Ownership, investment, and profit all rely on the ability to accumulate and control capital. Those who already have large amounts of wealth or influence can use that leverage to shape markets, policies, and opportunities. Supporters of the current system argue that money and markets create incentives that drive innovation, efficiency, and economic growth. Critics argue that the same system can also produce extreme inequality and concentrate power among a small number of individuals or institutions. So the debate isn't really about whether money exists, it clearly does, but about how much of the structure built around it is necessary. and how much of it reflects choices about who holds economic power and how resources are distributed within society. Story 40. That democracy can sometimes function more like an illusion of choice than true public control. In theory, democratic systems are built around the idea that citizens choose their leaders and influence policy through elections, public debate, and participation. The expectation is that governments ultimately answer to the people. However, critics argue that in practice the system can become much more complicated. Large political campaigns often require huge amounts of funding, which means candidates may rely heavily on donors, corporations, or powerful interest groups. Lobbyists and well-funded organizations can also play a major role in shaping legislation and policy decisions. Because of this, some people believe that political outcomes can end up reflecting the interests of wealthy groups or institutions more strongly than the average voter. Another factor is information. Media coverage, messaging strategies, and political narratives can strongly influence how people perceive issues and candidates. That can make it harder for voters to see the full picture behind political decisions. From this perspective, elections still happen and people still vote, but the range of choices or policies being presented might already be shaped by powerful forces behind the scenes. Supporters of democratic systems usually push back on this idea and argue that while the system isn't perfect, public pressure, elections, investigative journalism, and civic engagement still create real accountability over time. So the debate often comes down to how effectively democratic systems balance public participation with the influence of money, institutions, and power structures that exist within them.